Greetings and welcome to today's 10-minute painting lesson. We're going to begin here today, as we generally do, with a large damp square-headed brush, and we're going to apply a good amount of titanium white to the sky area. Then I'm going to go back to my palette, grab some additional titanium white, and begin to throw that down into the river right below, where it will be reflecting. Then I'm going to grab an older square-headed brush, one where the bristles kind of leaf off in varying directions. So when you make a dabbing motion just like this, you're under so many different implications and markings on the canvas. It looks like leaves and clusters of leaves in a distance, and it does so simply. It's a very easy way of getting a lot of detail that's ever changing and ensuring that your painting doesn't become mundane or lack detail. So what we're doing here is we're using a green. It is a mixture of primary yellow, primary blue, and some titanium white, really a lot of titanium white, and we're applying that to the background. This is going to blend to a point with the titanium white we just applied, but through a tapping motion, so you get a gradient from that white into that green. And that's essentially going to create a little bit of depth. It's going to make it look like that light is washing out part of the background, and then as it gets closer to us, we see more and more detail and more color. And with that in mind, we're actually going to get a bit of a more regular color green with less titanium white in it. We're going to apply that under that initial application and again continue to blend it out with that tapping motion. And the goal here is to ensure that the tops of the trees are all very white, they're very bright, there's a lot of light on them. But as we get down towards us and down towards the bottom of the trees, we're going to slowly make it darker, and we're going to add darker greens that simply have less titanium white in them, because as you move down the tree, you're going to have less light getting to that area. You see, the light, it can only pass through so many leaves, so many branches. So as you get down towards the bottom, there are so many shadows being cast along that area that you're just not going to have a lot of light there. So it's going to progressively get darker and darker, and that's why we're continuously going back with slightly darker shades of green, and eventually even incorporating a little bit of Mars black into that green as opposed to a titanium white. We're also going to create a much heavier contrast in the foreground. We're going to have very dark greens and very light greens. And we're going to do that because subjects in the foreground are generally much more noticeable. They have much more of a contrast in them. When you look at things very far in the background, the colors can kind of be very reflective and they reflect upon each other. They all adopt each other's colors. So you get something that's much more washed out and desaturated. Whereas the foreground has a lot more vibrant colors. You have some very dark pigments, some very light pigments. It's the entire range. So when you want to create a lot of depth in a painting, make sure that the foreground has a lot of contrast in it, and as you move towards the background, it gets lesser and lesser. Now I'm going to let that dry before I go in to work on the wood portion of the trees. And in the meantime, I'm just adding in some water, as you can see with the larger square-headed brush. I started with more of a medium blue. It's a primary blue mixed with a little bit of titanium white, a little bit of Mars black just to tone down the saturation a little bit and thicken the pigment. Then as we go farther back into the painting, I add more titanium white. I allow it to get brighter and brighter until eventually we mix in with that pure titanium white at the back, as it's going to reflect down into that water. Speaking of reflections, we're making some right now with the square-headed brush. I'm doing the exact same thing that I did up top, except this time I'm using less pressure so I don't cover the entirety of the area and some of the water shows through. Here I'm just kind of trying to do a very light remapping of essentially what I did on the top. I'm allowing it to remain semi-transparent. I don't have a lot of paint on my brush. Make sure that you have a very minimal amount for this area, and you can even make sure that your brush is a little bit damp for this portion. When you wet the old square-headed brushes, generally the bristles kind of come in together and you make less implications, but it's a fair trade for the more transparent look with the addition of water. Also worth noting, yet again, if you don't have an old square-headed brush, you can make one very simply by just taking a square-headed brush, peeling back the bristles, applying some pressure, and just ensuring that it has a little bit of inconsistency in it. They're not hard to make. Anyone can do it. It's a very easy process, and these brushes can save a lot of time. Now, from there, I'm going to let the water dry and I'm going to jump back up into the trees. This time I'm going to be using a smaller square-headed brush, some Mars Black, some Burnt Umber, creating a very dark base layer that we're going to build light on top of and create some depth around. But for this initial process, I'm just building the foundation that we can layer on top of. And I like generally to create a darker base and then add light on top of it. So that's what we're doing. And we're going to do this to most of our trees here in the foreground. Because they're in the foreground, they're going to be very stark, which is why we have such a dark pigment right now. And we're also using the smaller and medium-sized square-headed brushes because they can hold a good amount of paint, and that sharp edge really helps you render very detailed edging in the foreground for subjects that require it, much like these trees. It's very important that you think about the brush that you want to use for each subject. Now, an example here, we're using this small square-headed brush because we want very sharp edges. But if we wanted a round edge, if we wanted something that's much more feathered, much more soft, maybe it has a gradient from one pigment into the next, like clouds or fog, we might want to use a round-headed brush because it innately has a very soft, feathered edge that dissipates along, and that isn't ideal for trees, but it is ideal for other subjects. So just try to keep that in the back of your head. Now here I'm going back in and I'm adding in some additional trees. I'm using a much brighter color because it's farther away, and the light is going to reflect much more so onto it. The colors are going to blend much more, and so we're going to get something that's a much more soft application. This application is a burnt umber. It has a little bit of titanium white, it has a little bit of Mars Black to desaturate it, but it also has a good amount of water to ensure that it is nice and thin. Then I'm going back up to the tops of my trees and I'm adding in some additional branches just to ensure that they're interesting. Also worth noting, try to ensure that your trees, your rocks, everything really is always evolving and changing. You don't want two things to look too similar. That's how you can render a very cartoony aesthetic. If you want something to be engaging and continuously engaging for the viewer, I would definitely advise you to always have things evolving and changing. Now, we've been talking a lot about depth in this painting, about making the background more washed out, about adding contrast to the foreground, about having the light wrap around the trees. But we're also going to do that down here in the rocks as well. So we're starting with a very simple base layer. It's fairly dark. Then we're going to go back, we're going to add our midtones, and we're going to add our highlights on top of it. So it's a very similar process from each subject. We did it with the foliage, we're going to do it with the trees, and we're also going to do it with the rocks. But another way to show depth is simply by using perspective. So you notice as we get farther into the background, the rocks get smaller, and the trees also get smaller. They aren't actually smaller than the ones in the foreground, but because of how we perceive them, they look much smaller because they're much farther away. So by having the light wrap around your subject and having it get larger or smaller in the foreground and background, you can really instill a lot of depth and work with your acrylic paintings fairly well. Now, from there, on the topic of depth, yet again, I'm going in and I'm adding some highlights to these rocks with the smaller square-headed brush. I'm having a lot of the rocks slant down and slope into the water just so I can kind of create some leading lines, but they're not all the same, and I'm trying to apply highlights to different areas and different highlights. So some of the whites or grays are going to be a little bit brighter or darker than others, and that's a good thing. You don't want them all to be too consistent. I'm then going back in, doing a little bit of blending with a very soft touch of my brush. That way we get even more of a gradient. And that way we have that highlight touching the top of the rock, then we have a mid-tone, then we have a dark tone. And the more tones you can get like that, the better the painting is going to be. The more interesting and captivating it's going to be. So you really want to go back in a number of times, if you have time, and really build those up. I'm going to do the same thing right here in the tree with a burnt umber and a titanium white. So I'm starting on the sides of the trees that are going to be hitting the light. They're going to have the most light reflected upon them, and I'm going to start working on our bark, as you can see here. I'm starting with the largest branches, and then I'm kind of moving to the smaller ones from there. And we can go back and re-add in additional highlights as much as we want. But this is essentially a spring version of our painting. So it's not going to have many leaves, it's not going to have too much life or highlights. It's a nice transition into the season. But I know a lot of you would probably want to see a summer version, something that's much more conventional. So I did take some extra time, and I thought I'd speed it up and show you how you could turn this spring painting into more of a summer painting with a little bit more life. So here I'm just going back in, adding in some additional branches that would have grown out. Then I'm going to switch over to the older square-headed brush. I'm going to add some foliage to the tops that wouldn't have bloomed yet. And I'm also going to add a little bit of running water as well, just to add some additional interest into the bottom of the painting to counter the additional interest to the top of the painting. So I'm just using that small square-headed brush, some titanium white and some water, and adding in some little movements. The edge that's closest to us is sharp, and then it blends into the background. And there we have it. There's our 10-minute spring version, our 13-minute summer version. I truly hope you've enjoyed. I hope you feel like you've learned something. If you'd like to learn more, there is a link in the description to my ebook, Acrylics for Beginners. It essentially teaches you the essentials. It talks about how to blend with water, how to mix your paints, also how to create depth in your painting. So if you'd like to learn more about that, there is a link in the description. I also have my new ebook, Painting Prompts for Beginners, out there as well. It's essentially 21 digital sketches for you to work from on days where you're not feeling that creative, but you still want to do a painting, learn, and get better at your craft. If you'd like hour-long lessons just like this, they are available over on the Patreon, link in the description. In those, I also show you when I'm mixing my paint, when I'm grabbing water, all of the extra little things we don't have time for in these lessons. But with all of that being said, I would like to say a big thank you. I do post every Saturday. I hope to see you next Saturday. And above all, as always, stay creative.